All right. Thanks everybody for coming out. So great to see so many friends and colleagues and current students and former students and everybody else. It's awesome. Um, so yeah, thanks for coming here. And I hope that this will be a fun presentation. Am I allowed to present? Am I allowed to share
You
screen? Oh, I
should
am.
have full access. Yeah. Let me know if anything goes
Sweet.
sideways on you.
Looks good. All right, so I'm going to try to get some of the Zoom interface out of the way here. And uh, shout out to one of my UC Davis students, Jenny, who turned me on to this um, this Google template. I had a lot of fun kind of using this fun Google template to build this presentation the other day. So hopefully it'll be kind of fun. I hope it'll be entertaining. So yeah, so shout out to her for that, and yeah, let's sort of talk about this stuff. So I've been working on this little project here that I've been working on for a little while now, and I thought it would be fun to sort of present the process. So here's the agenda for the evening. Sort of the current state of the project. It's not done by any means, and I hope that if you have questions or if you have ideas or anything like that that you want to sort of that you want to talk about with it or ideas for it, feel free to sort of pop in. And Nolan, if you can watch the chat for me, I have all that stuff collapsed so I can see what's on my screen, but
Sure thing.
if you want to post questions in the chat, that's fine too. So feel free to interrupt as we go along here. But we'll start with sort of the state of the project, where it is now, and then talk about the creative process. And this is kind of, whoops, somebody's got an echo going on there. Talk about this creative process and sort of how this thing got developed or sort of how it goes along. And then some of the fun challenges along the way that always kind of present themselves when you're working on this stuff. So let's take a look at the state of the project. This link was included, and I don't know if everybody's had a chance to look at it, but essentially I thought it would be kind of fun to sort of play around with this thing, and it's working as a simulation. So inspired by the pandemic, you know, these radio buttons become infected and then have the potential of infecting neighbor radio buttons as the simulation runs. And you can infect additional members as you go along. The time intervals, basically, the simulation works where it goes through each radio button and checks all its neighbors and then uses a percentage to either infect them or not infect them. And then after a certain amount of time, they can either heal and get better. We should see some of that going on now. So the green ones indicate that they've healed, and some of them will die. So that's kind of sad when that happens, but we'll see some of them die eventually if we go on here. And to sort of play around with it further, I've created some settings here. So you can actually open up the settings and you can increase the transmission rate, the survival, you make more of them survive or more of them die. You can change sort of how soon they will either get well or die, and you can adjust the simulation speed, make it go faster or slower, that kind of stuff as well. Although that one seems to be broken at the moment. Update settings. So now that I've set more of them to die in the transmission speed, we should start seeing some deaths here. So this is kind of the current state of the project. There's one that died down there. A bunch of them are dying now. So this is kind of the current state of the project and kind of where it's at the moment with this stuff. All right, cool. So we'll let that just kind of run in the background, and that's kind of fun. We can come check on it later. Okay, so inspiration for this, there's this book, Code is Creative Medium. Glenda was very kind to get me this book, and Glenda's here tonight. Hi, Glenda, thanks for coming. This book is a fun book. I recommend it. And this is linked, and I'll put out the link to the slides too, so you guys can have the slides there as well. But Glenda got me this book, and it's fantastic. It's like chock full of ideas for interactive creative projects. And the first sort of set of creative projects have to do with working with patterns. And that was kind of what inspired this. And in fact, if there's a downside to this book, it's that like, I'll be working on sort of the first ideas in this book probably for the next 5 years. And then maybe I'll get to, and the book is like, so I'm working basically on page 1, and there's like 100 pages of different projects you could work on. So, there's just so much in here that you could sort of dig into, and all of it could take you a long time to work through. So that's sort of an inspiration for this. Going on from here, I want to sort of talk about because this is always a question about, which frameworks and tools and whatever did you use. So I'm going to talk about all the frameworks and tools that I did not use. So there's no React.js in this, no React.js, no Vue.js. There isn't any AngularJS or any stinking horrible Bootstrap, or even worse, the horrible ugly Tailwind CSS. There isn't any Less or Sass. There isn't any Node.js or Express.js or Gulp or Grunt or Webpack or any of those fun things. And there isn't any jQuery neither. So it's all just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript without any of these fancy things. And now that I have sufficiently dissed everybody's favorite framework or tool or system or whatever, it may be that I should be using some of these, and I'm certainly open to if you think, oh boy, this would be so much easier if Bill just used blah, 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 please let me know. There may be some good places for some of this stuff. I particularly have my eye on Vue.js for some of the things that I'm doing here, as we'll see going forward. But we'll see. At this point, it's just plain HTML, CSS, and JavaScript, nothing fancy, all just kind of built from scratch. And the other thing I should say is that the project at this point has been, the time I've spent on it is pretty much 2 weekends. There was a weekend in the summer and then a weekend about a month later, and everything I've done has kind of been done within those 2 weekends. So now we're going to move on to sort of the second part of this project, which is the second part of this presentation, which is sort of talking about sort of the process of building this thing. And I started with just some randomly lit radio buttons, and I have all of this open over here. So I have the different versions here that we can talk about here. And if we look at version 1 here, there's just very little in the HTML file, and the script file includes a few variables and a few functions to run. It's not very fancy. There's not too much here, but I was kind of just playing around with the idea of, what if we had, wait, no, I want desktop, that's what I want. This one here and this one here, this one here. So as this page loads, the radio buttons get added and they start like randomly becoming checked or unchecked, which I thought was kind of fun and interesting. I know that this is not necessarily a unique idea. There are other people who are working with form elements as a tool for creating artwork. Glenda sent me a really great example last week of one that is really cool, where the guy's using checkboxes. And I've seen others in the past, but I've been thinking a lot about kind of JavaScript and the web and sort of the creative medium of the web, and sort of thinking about form elements are such a web thing, and like, could you do something kind of fun and creative and wacky with just form elements? And so this is going, I'm kind of playing around with this idea and with randomly lit buttons, but the the pandemic was raging at the time in August when I was doing this. The Delta variant was picking up and everybody was getting fearful. And I was about to get on a plane to go to the East Coast. So I was pretty nervous about that. So I thought, wouldn't it be interesting if the buttons started to infect each other? That would be kind of cool. So, so from this version of just sort of randomly turning on and off buttons, I went on to version 2, which we can look at sort of, the HTML is still very short and the script here. There's a few more variables and the script is a little bit longer. It's kind of not very interesting to watch, but I'll bring it up anyway, just so you can kind of see what's going on there. So I can open example 2. So this one, probably I should set the browser to a smaller screen size because otherwise it's going to go forever. But it sets a certain percentage of them as infected, and then it starts infecting the ones on either side of it. So this was kind of my first foray into sort of thinking about the radio buttons as infecting other radio buttons, but it's kind of slow and not very exciting to watch. But this is sort of the next iteration of where this went. And we'll just wait for one row to finish here and then see it starting to infect some of the ones around them. And then it goes on and does the next row, and it'll keep doing that until the entire screen is filled up with radio buttons that are infected and infecting each other. So we can let that one kind of run. Go back to this one and see, okay, so this one's continuing to go here. So yeah, so there's that. And then for the third one, it's starting to really kind of take shape in the third version here. Let's go take a look at the third version. So the third version, I've got the HTML is getting a little bit longer. I've got some styles finally. So I've actually got some styling going on. And the script, you can see my list of variables is starting to get a little bit longer. And the row, it's going to create different rows and then sort of go through and infect the elements this way. Let's take a look and see how this one actually runs here. I think that's probably the most interesting thing. Move that zoom thing out of the way there. And go up to version 3. All right, so now it got kind of boring waiting for them to draw all the radio buttons one at a time. So here instead I have it, actually no, this one is still creating them one at a time rather than creating the rows, but I have it doing it a little bit faster. So it creates all of the radio buttons down the entire screen. There is kind of this interface element down here, which is saying it's creating the population. So that's running. And I probably should have made my screen a little bit narrower for this because we have to wait until it gets to the end. But we will wait and watch it. Meanwhile, I'll take a look at the chat and see if there's anything that has anybody has any questions.
Steve had a super important question for you in the chat, Bill.
What was that?
He asked, how does the vaccine protect the buttons?
That's a really good question. In fact, I decided not to include anything about vaccines in here. But that's something that I have been thinking about and might add to this in terms of either allowing buttons once they heal from, because some of them do heal from getting sick, and then like what if you could actually like vaccinate some of them, and how would that affect the thing here? So you can see it with this version, it's sort of coming up with this sort of little interface here that's sort of telling you what's going on as it goes from each sort of iteration. It comes up, but there's not a lot of animation here, so you have to kind of watch it yeah, and sort of catch the radio buttons as they're getting infected. So I really thought it would be a good idea to do something a little bit more with that, to make it a little bit explicit about exactly what's going on here, because it's a little bit boring to watch currently. But I did like where it was going. I thought it was pretty cool. All life is an experiment. Ralph Waldo Emerson's kind of a good quote at this point in terms of sort of thinking about this sort of stuff. Here's a good place for a quote. The creative process is not like a situation where you get struck by a single lightning bolt. You have ongoing discoveries and there's an ongoing creative revelations. You must allow yourself room for your ideas to blossom, take root, and grow. It's by this Carlton Cuse guy, who's an American producer. I looked into what he's produced and I don't like a single thing he's produced, but I really like the quote. He's most famous for working on Lost, which I still feel somewhat disgruntled about, having watched all of that show and not gotten much of anything out of it except a bunch of people running around an island. But I thought that was a really cool quote and sort of reflects sort of my creative process. I like to sort of take these things and then just kind of run with them and keep going. So at this point, I kind of liked where the thing was going, and I figured it was time to sort of design a little bit more of an interface for it. So the fourth version has a bit of an interface. So I'm going to open file. Let's see here. Let's go and take a look at the version 4 of the interface here. And for this one, I am going to actually pull this off like so. And so now I've got this interface over here, and I kind of felt like having the information come up in the middle of the screen was a little bit too much. Plus, I've added these animations that highlight as the thing is running. You can see the light yellow is checking the buttons around it, and then the dark yellow is they're getting infected. And then again, we'll have the green for when they become healed, or a slightly different color for when they become broken. But I did actually, at this point, I thought it would be kind of cool to create sort of a mobile interface. It's not perfect and working completely yet, but it does kind of work. It needs a little bit more work, especially on Safari. Safari on mobile is kind of like our new Internet Explorer in terms of browsers. It just doesn't quite behave the way you expect. But I thought it would be kind of cool to make it so it would work on mobile. And so I did sort of add a mobile interface there for it, along with these additional things here, these additional variations here on the buttons and how they're running. So I thought that was kind of fun and cool. So that's the fourth version. We can stick that up here as well. Go back, look at the first version. Oh no, that's not the first version. Oh, that's the current version. That's not it. There it is. So this one's still running. That one's still going, although it seems to have gotten stuck at 4 lines. This one's still going. And now we've got this one going as well. All right. So I added the interface, and I thought that was kind of fun. We have the population here. We've got this, the ticker came in at the bottom here, sort of showing what's going on, and we're counting up deaths. But all of the numbers are kind of baked in. So at this point, then after that, this is sort of the end of my first weekend of working on this. And I kind of pushed through and finished up a few minor features for version 1. And at that point, I was like, okay, this is ready to show to a few people. And I put it up online. So that's kind of, this is kind of our my first finished version here. Programming is a 4-letter word. I like that quote too. So filled this presentation with some fun quotes. So we can go look here at version 1. And one thing you'll notice with version 1 is that I added this little toggle here so that if you didn't want to watch these little things pop up, you could turn them off. This is ultimately an interface element that I decided to get rid of, but I don't know, maybe it's a good idea. So you could actually turn those off and they'll come up or not come up. But one of the things that I really liked about this version, or I think it comes up in this version. Let's go look at the code here just for a minute while that's running. So we can go take a look at. So here's our first version. And if we look at the script file here, you can see now I've got kind of a longer list of variables and various calculations that we're using to sort of keep track of this stuff. So this is creating each row, one row at a time. So it creates all the rows of the buttons. And then the initial infection runs, and that determines how many are going to become initially infected. And then start interval runs, which runs this transmit infection here. And I'm going through this stuff because these are pieces that have pretty much stayed up into the current version, but they've changed a little bit. So the transmit infection is the one that's checking. So we're going through and we're using set timeout to check the item above, the item below, the item to the left, and the item to the right. And then they've got a percentage chance of becoming infected in each one of those. And I have an object here that's sort of keeping track of which items are sick and which items are not. And these all happen in a set timeout. So there's a little bit of a timer here for 1/100th of a 100 milliseconds or 1/100th of a second, basically. So yeah, so that's kind of, or actually that's 1/10 of a second, 1/10 of a second. So yeah, so and then if it's not sick, then it has a chance of, we're using some math to decide whether it's got a chance to die or a chance to survive, basically. And looking at that kind of stuff. So here's the surrounding items. This is where it's going through and checking the one above and the one below and the one next and ones on either side, and then deciding if it's going to survive or not. So that's kind of fun. Let's come back here and see what that's doing. So you'll notice here that now when it survives and turns green, there's a very slight subtle difference in that when it turns green, there was one there, you'll see it turns green and then it waits a second before it takes the radio button out. So, you know, you can see here, if I click on this, it'll turn green and then it'll take a second to remove the radio button. So I was doing, you know, like some of these really subtle things really kind of matter to me, because otherwise it would turn green, and by the time it turned green, it had already been healed and the button was gone. You wouldn't actually see it removing the button. So it's got some of these sort of subtle changes that kind of come into play here and make that one work. All right, so this is version 1. And again, I had sort of worked on this for a full weekend, and I showed it to my wife and she was like, wow, you're doing data modeling. You know, it's very rare that I actually impress my wife with anything that I'm actually doing. But this sort of pushes into her area of interest. So I was like, oh, cool. She's kind of into this. And so I was like, you know, it would be really cool if I could add some controls so that users could sort of adjust the way that the simulation runs, rather than just using the hard baked in numbers that I have for percentages of transmission and all that kind of fun stuff. So that's kind of what sort of became the second weekend's worth of work, was getting that all to work. So yeah, so next steps, I wanted to add those controls in the simulations, kind of take it to that next level. and do all that kind of stuff. There's a lot of those numbers that are baked into the first version that I thought would be kind of fun to push to that next level there. So so I got two new versions. So there's version 2 and version 3. And it turns out adding these controls was kind of a big job, but it was fun. And we can take a look at these two new versions here of it. So version 2, this one here, no, sorry. It's really this one here. It's actually the 6th version, but I was calling it version 2. So this version looks pretty much the same as the other version, except I changed this thing that comes up, and now you can actually do these controls. And this was quite a trick to figure this out. And I'll talk about this more in the challenges, but getting a double track range element to work is kind of a task. But we've got basically 3 different controls in the second version. What percentage they are initially sick from a low range to a high range, the transmission rate, and then the survival death rate, which is another. So this is the percentage at which they'll survive, and this is the percentage at which they'll die, and you can change the settings. And I also moved all of the instructions or information about it in here as well. So rather than having it sort of pop up with that information, I put that in there. So this is pretty close to what you've seen with the third version, except it's got these, or with the first version, except it's got these controls in here. So you can see a lot more of them became sick. I was also playing with the timing of this one, with the notion that I would add a control for being able to control the time. So this one runs much slower, so you can really see it run. And you'll notice if you watch this one run that it does have some problems with the actual algorithm that I needed to figure out. Turn those off. All right. And because not all of the buttons would always get checked quite right. And it really took me a while to kind of figure out what the problem with that was all about. That was kind of a good challenge to kind of figure out. But this one's moving along at kind of a slower pace here. That's kind of cool. And then we've got version 3, which you saw right from the beginning, which added the progress bar. So this one is continuing to run over here. And so I've added this progress bar here because it's not always clear exactly how much of this we need to get through. It added the ability to change the settings midway while it's actually running, which was kind of cool. And then you can actually get the information thing back again if you want to figure out what the heck is going on in here. And for a 4th version, I was thinking it would be really cool if this thing had kind of a soundtrack that you could turn on and off. And I have a good friend who has kind of a crazy synthesizer set up in his house. So I asked him if he would actually like record some short sounds for me from his synthesizer setup that I could integrate into this. And I've started working on that, but it sounds horrible. I think I have to reshare if I want to show you that one, because I have to turn it on so you can actually hear the sound and hear how horrible it is. I don't know if anybody's interested in hearing what that sounds like, but I can put that one on if you're interested.
You're getting a few hands being raised in the video chat saying yes, people would like to hear the sound, Bill.
Let me stop sharing for a minute, because I think when I turn on sharing, I have to tell it to share audio, share sound. There we go. Let's try this again. Share sound. All right, let's hear what this sounds like. You're going to be sorry. Let's let's see. So this is version, where is it? 8 in progress here. All right, here we go. I'll set more of them here. Oh, and we should actually also, to get the full effect, should change these as well and bring this down to 0. Change settings. I assume that sounds coming through.
Yep, it's coming through.
It's a little less bad if you slow it down. Simulation speed. Basically, I have 2 versions of sounds for each type of sound. There's like 12 possible sounds that could be going on here. It's pretty horrible. I'm kind of thinking, rather than using little recorded sounds, doing something with native JavaScript. All right, I'm going to stop that. I don't have the button actually working yet. But I was thinking of doing something with, instead of using recorded sounds, maybe using JavaScript to actually generate sounds and that kind of stuff. I think that might actually work out a little bit better, but I haven't gotten there yet. That's going to be another weekend's worth of work probably as that goes through. But yeah, it's pretty awful. I don't know what the comments are. Hopefully.
The comments are all pretty complimentary. You've got a couple of questions in the chat too, whenever you've got a point.
Oh, okay. Questions. Who's got questions? I don't have time to
let's see. First one, Linda was asking, does the simulation restart when the window is resized during runtime?
It doesn't. So that's kind of a problem. I need to fix that so that if you resize the window, it actually stops the simulation and starts all over again. Because otherwise you end up with you end up with scrolling and this kind of thing going on. So that's something that needs to be fixed for sure. That's a really good question. So yeah, that's definitely on the list of things to kind of fix going forward. There was something else that made me think of, but now I forget what it is. I don't know. Other questions?
Yeah, there was one from Marco. He asked, what happens when you slow it down?
Okay, yeah. So you can really slow this thing down quite a bit. It becomes a little bit more, it becomes a little bit boring to watch, but you can actually really, I do have it set so you can actually slow it way down and actually see it go around each element and decide whether or not it's going to infect or not. And you can still, another thing I've been, you can infect these elements by doing this or uninfect them by clearing them that way. But another feature that I thought would be fun would be to, when you click on them, you start a super spreader event. That's kind of a plan in the works is to incorporate that, because there's definitely, like, you want to interact with it more than just watch it. You want to start clicking on things and do stuff to it and have an effect on it. And you can, but it's just, it doesn't feel very significant to just click on the buttons and have them become infected. So it'd be kind of fun if you could actually, like, click on one and it immediately infects the ones around it, that kind of stuff. So that would be kind of a fun thing to do. So I might add that going forward as well. And in the controls, you could set like how big the super spreader event is, how wide a range an infected element might infect other elements or members of the population. Would be kind of fun. Okay, cool.
One more question came in too, Bill. Trisha asked, how did you choose the color scheme?
The color scheme you saw, I picked this color scheme way back when I was working on the interface, and I was just playing around with different gradients. I love this IBM Plex font. So that's the only thing I'm loading that's not here. It's a Google font. But I love the IBM Plex font, and I wanted to keep it sort of in the aesthetic of radio buttons and kind of very basic web look, but I like this gradient in here. So I kind of used a gradient tool to create the gradient, and then I'm using that gradient as sort of the main thing that's affecting those colors. And then these colors here, I don't know, I went through and just kind of picked some different colors from a color scheme that I thought would work well together. Yeah, good question. I don't know if I have a better answer for you than that. Okay, so that kind of gets us through the various versions of this thing, so you can kind of see where they all come from. That sort of finishes up our second part of our presentation, and we can go into the third part, which is sort of dealing with the kinds of problems. And I really like this quote from Ellen Ullman, who's a programmer. Programming is the art of algorithm design and the craft of debugging errant code. And there's definitely a lot of that in the process of making something like this, or really anything that's got even a little bit of complexity to it, sort of figuring out how these different pieces work together. And I wanted to go through and sort of talk about some of the specific challenges that came up while I'm working on it so far. And before I even get to that, I guess I should mention that as I was working on version 3, I needed to build in something around like what happens if they all die, or what happens if the infection is completely eradicated. How do you end the simulation? So I had to build in some additional screens for that kind of stuff for the third version as well, this version here. And if you go into this is an awful lot. I'm not going to try to make them all die here, but you could go into the settings and set it so that the transmission rate is really low, and the survival rate and death rate. You could eradicate this. Oops. You could eradicate this thing pretty quickly, speed it up again by doing that, and a lot of the sick members will heal. The ones that are dead are dead. So I had to come up with sort of some ways of dealing with what happens if the simulation ends, and deal with that. So I built that also into this third version. Okay, cool. So there's that. And then adding sound, yeah, we looked at that. That's, is it a good idea or not? Not so sure. You guys can let me know if you think it's a good idea to continue working on that or not, but that's cooking along. Okay, so challenges. There've been a lot of fun challenges for this project. Some of them to sort of think about. Oh, before we do it, time for another quote. Martin Luther King Jr., "The ultimate measure of a man is not where he stands in the moment of comfort and convenience, but where he stands at times of challenge and controversy." And other than the very genderified quote, I really love this quote. It's great because, when you're doing this kind of stuff, you're going to run into challenges. And those are always part of the process, and part of the fun is figuring out how to deal with this kind of stuff. So just a few of the challenges is, for example, getting a consistent display of radio buttons across different browsers is actually pretty challenging. And it's ultimately a CSS problem, but different browsers have their different ways of displaying radio buttons. And I still haven't got it absolutely perfectly, but it's pretty close. It works pretty well now. But I had to spend quite a bit of time kind of figuring out exactly how to get them to display right. So there's that sort of thing. The algorithm itself, and general algorithm design in terms of managing, when it went from just the first version where I had all the numbers built in to where you could kind of control it, I realized that there were problems in the algorithm that I had to track down and figure out. And I spent a lot of time actually finding those, fixing those problems. The controls and creating two-handed range sliders is another thing that's just challenging. I was really kind of surprised that this is not a thing in HTML. And really, basically what you have to do is take two range elements and put them one on top of another and use CSS and some really ugly JavaScript to kind of make that work, which is kind of horrible. And we'll look at that specifically, but that I was kind of surprised that that's not something that you can do in HTML, have two handles on a range control. And it doesn't seem to be something that's in the specification that they're working on for the future either, which seems kind of strange to me. But anyway, event handlers, adding and removing appropriate event handlers. One of the things that's confusing about JavaScript is you don't always know which elements have event handlers on them and which ones don't. There's not an easy way to see, oh, these elements have event handlers, as far as I can tell. And keeping track of the recursion, this really goes with the algorithm thing. You know, there's all these timers that are running on their own time, and that kind of becomes difficult to work with, and managing the data and keeping track of which elements are sick and which elements are not sick. These are all kinds of fun challenges. We won't look at all of them, but I figured we could look at a couple of them. 7:14, yeah, perfect timing. We can look at a few of these and call it done. So yeah, again, the double-handed range input is really hard. Thank you to this Muhammad Asif for creating this tutorial here. So basically, I use this tutorial here. Oops, demo, that's just a picture. Go away. There we go. So I use this, you know, he put this together, which was awesome. So I used that to sort of figure out how to make this thing work. But it comes with a whole bunch of CSS and kind of really ugly JavaScript to make it work. And I actually have over here, it took me about a half day just to get the range slider thing to work. So I have this actually in a separate file, trying to get these range sliders to work. And you get these, so this is the, if you download from his website, this is what you actually get, is this thing here. So he's got this horrible JavaScript built in here for keeping track of the children of this range slider, because you've got the inverse left and the inverse right. You've got all these elements sort of making up this one slider. And you're sort of working with all the children of the slider to get it to actually work. And which child is which and which is doing what is hard to figure out. So this is something that I've kind of put right into my project. So I made my version here, and I at least pulled the script out and put it in its own script file. But it's still pretty ugly. And if we go over and just look at that page, it was a good half a day just kind of working with this thing. Let's see here. Just by file name, that makes it easier. And index. So you can see, you know, this is without the actual simulation, but this is just building the various sliders and these rangefinder things, and the transmission rate and this kind of stuff. Go ahead. You have a question? That's working. Okay. So getting these elements to actually work was pretty challenging, and kind of horrible JavaScript, but there's all of that. And then besides that, so this is another thing that's kind of a challenge. If we go back to the current version here, so if you change the settings, when you click on this, you want to bring it up showing the last settings that it was set at, not the the default settings. So I had to figure out a way to get the settings that are currently set updated in here. And that was another thing that was kind of challenging. If we go over and actually look at the code to do that, I mean, to update this with that information, you'd have to sort of go in and find all the right things here to actually update in the code to kind of get the correct setting to show up on the page. So what I did instead, if we go back to, this is our version 3 here, go down to the bottom here. So I've just basically, I'm replacing the entire guts of the entire slider with the correct data kind of going into it to get it to update. So this entire thing just gets kind of placed in using inner HTML. Which we were talking about just the other day, the inner HTML may not be the right thing to use. And this is the thing that, like, maybe this is a thing that Vue.js could do. Like, Vue.js seems like this is the kind of thing that this is sort of designed to do. So maybe I need to sort of suck it up and start using Vue.js for this kind of thing. But I haven't done a lot with it, but I've done enough to realize that, like, creating these sort of template sort of things for dynamic data on your page is kind of the jam for Vue.js. So yeah, so that was a really fun challenge, is kind of figuring all that out and getting that to work right. That took a while to get that to actually work. And then there was another thing where the recursion just wasn't working quite right. And especially, I mentioned this before, especially with once we were able to add the controls in there, I was noticing that sometimes the radio buttons wouldn't check the ones around them. They get skipped over, or something weird was going on with it. And so I created sort of this flow chart here to kind of explore what some of the differences were. And this is where, recursion can be problematic. And I had basically processed this item is where, it goes in and actually makes it sick or not. And I was running this function 3 times in here. And sometimes you have to wait until it checks the item above, the item below, the item left, and the item right. And it's got to wait for all of those, even if it's a short amount of wait before it does this. And then other times, if it doesn't have any sick neighbors, it does it right away. Or if it, and so there was just too many of these. And so one of the problems with JavaScript, in my opinion, or one of the difficult things about it, is that the event loop, stuff gets stuffed into the event loop, and there's no easy way to go see exactly what's in the event loop. And so it's easy to end up with sort of multiple versions of the program running, at slightly off times, and weird stuff can happen. So it took a while to kind of track that down. There's no good way of kind of seeing the event loop here and try to figure that out. But I do love recursion. Anybody who knows me knows that, like, recursion is like one of my favorite things to play around with. And I love this quote from Andy Warhol. Isn't life a series of images that change as they repeat themselves? Perfect for recursion. So there's that. That's it for my presentation. Thank you. Do you have any questions? This slide deck was created by this. You can download these things from SlidesGo. Again, my student Jenny had turned me on to this, which I thought was awesome.
Hello, Bill Mead.
Yes, go ahead, Trisha.
So I have a question. So, like, how many days did you do this? Or how many months did you do this project?
So I spent basically 2 weekends working on it. With maybe a little bit of extra time in between, but not a lot. The first version was finished, basically everything up through the first version was finished in 1 weekend in August. And then about, I don't know, 3 or 4 weeks ago, I spent a weekend doing the second version with all the controls.
So how many total of days have you done? this project?
Maybe 6 total.
You're good.
Oh, thanks.
And then I mean, how did you get this concept, from the very beginning? Like, how did you conceptualize this project at first before creating it?
So, I mean, that's the thing, is that that's one of the main things I want to communicate here, is that I didn't really my ideas happen because they build on other ideas. So I kind of build a little thing and then see where it takes me and what I think is interesting, show it to a few people and get some feedback on it, and then do a little bit more. So I don't know. What do you guys think? What should I do next? Should I keep working on the sound, or is there something else I should work on?
You should choose another sound effect.
You've got several suggestions about features and UI things in the chat, Bill. There's probably 5 or 6 in there at least from
22
people.
messages that I haven't read.
Yeah, pretty much. I'll save the when I export the video, I'll save the chat log and send it to you so you can read through all those.
Yeah.
Several people are mentioning and working on the sound.
Okay.
Yeah, you should do that.
Yeah, I'd like to get the sound to work. I think that would be fun.
Bill, I got to say, this is probably the 3rd or 4th project you've done like this for our group. And they're always really fun to see how you start with one tiny little idea and then build on it and build on it and build on it. And you're always really, really good about showing all of those iterative steps in your presentation. So we can see how you went from, I want to play with a checkbox today, into some wild JavaScript animation library that you build 2 weeks later that does all kinds of really fascinating things that are fun to look at. So thank you for presenting this one. This is great.
Sure. Other questions, suggestions? Well, I guess I will stop sharing my screen. And
Bill, what was the hardest part of the project for you?
I think the hardest part was well, the 2 hardest parts were the things that I talked about. Getting the double-handed slider thing to work was really a pain. And it seemed like something that shouldn't be that difficult to do, but it really took a lot of time. That, and tracing down these issues with some buttons not getting checked properly and chasing that stuff down was that algorithm stuff can be really hard to track down, especially with the recursion stuff, because you can't really see exactly what's going on. So that can be kind of fun. So I would say those are those were sort of the biggest challenges. Also, just getting radio buttons to display properly on across various browsers is challenging. If you look at it in Safari, it does actually work in Safari, but it does look very different and a little bit different in Firefox. But yeah. Other questions?
I know you mentioned that you did not use any JavaScript libraries for this, but I noticed that you wrote it all in a procedural format too. You didn't even use like a vanilla JavaScript class or anything kind of object-oriented in that regard. Is there any, I was just going to ask, I was curious if that was another conscious decision you made, like not using Vue or React, or if that was just sort of organically how you wrote code and how it sort of just became itself.
Yeah, I mean, I for React and for some of these things, it always feels kind of nuts to me to have this thing downloading 60 megabytes of dependencies to sort of play around with some code in it. I don't know. There may be some reason to sort of move into some of that stuff, but I haven't found a reason for it yet for this project. I could certainly see, if you're working with a group of people and you're going to start sort of parsing out different parts of the project, it might make more sense to sort of break it up into different pieces and have it be more modular. But for my way of thinking and sort of working with stuff, like the procedural stuff works really well for me.
Cool. Thank you.
Yeah. But I don't know. I mean, maybe for some of those controls, I'm starting to think maybe Vue.js is the way to go.
Vue.js, or at least maybe a web component of some sort.
Yeah, maybe.
Something.
And maybe, oh yeah, a web component may be a good solution for this two-handled.
Oh yeah, I hadn't thought about that. You're right.
As I knew it was gray underneath.
She was like,
Trisha's background. Yeah. Any other questions or comments or thoughts?
There was a question in the chat. Luca asked, is there any chance you can make it a 2-player game?
Oh, wow. That would be kind of fun. 2-player game. How would that work? I'm not sure. That might be an interesting, fun thing to try. Have it run off of a server where multiple people could be, where you could have like 2 different sets of infections competing with each other. That could be really interesting.
Yeah, Bill, that might work with WebRTC.
Okay. Huh. I'll have to look into that. That sounds really cool. Hey
I
guys.
have a feeling that I'm seeing you the whole week, so.
Yeah, that's awesome. That's a really great suggestion. I'll have to look into sort of thinking about that. All right, well, it's 7:30. That means everybody's been sort of listening to me go on for about an hour here. But thanks everybody for coming, and it's really fun to present this stuff. And please come back to SAC Interactive. And if you have something you want to present, it doesn't have to be finished. It doesn't have to be polished. It doesn't have to be perfect. We love to see everything that you guys are working on. So please let us know. Let either me or Nolan know. It's a really great place to sort of practice talking about your work and talking about stuff, and it's fun and casual.